right now. Okay, perfect. So it's really my pleasure to open today's discussion on making African migration research visible on behalf of AMMODI. AMMODI, or the African Migration Mobility and Displacement Group, is a so-called collaborative research group under the AEGIS network, which is the European African Studies Network, and it's run by Jesper Bjarnersen, Laura Lambert, and Leander Candelici, and myself. And one of the aims of AMMODI, which was created in 2017, is to promote collaboration between researchers and to strengthen the network's relevance, reach, and visibility, especially in Africa. And this has really actually become more or less our central aim as we have developed. And one persistence, of course, and challenge, and one challenge which persists in fostering such interaction is related to the global inequalities in knowledge production, namely whereby African scholars are not adequately cited or engaged with in debates based and dominated by research in the global north. As a first step in trying to counteract these challenges and these problems, we have launched an interactive database to find research from and by our Africa-based colleagues. And so the database has two sections. In a first list of publications by Africa-based scholars, there are a total of 305 publications, and you can search for these topics through keywords like remittances or trafficking to find what you may be looking for. We also have a second list called of Africa-based scholars, and here you can find potential collaborators or scholars that you would like to exchange with on your research. And there we have a database of 209 Africa-based scholars at the moment. And again, you can search through the list using keywords such as a place like Nigeria, a subject like law or anthropology, or a topic like pastoralism, for example. These lists, and I will share the link to them in the chat in a minute, are a starting point and by no means exhaustive. So we have a section on the website also dedicated to making new suggestions for authors and papers, or making any corrections or comments that you may have. So please do use them, interact with them, engage with them, and let us know when you know of additional people that are not on the database, as you know, for the time being, or additional papers that you've come across that are important to include. And of course, another way we want to continue sort of talking about the challenges and discussing them is the conversation we're having today. So in the interest of time, I'm going to pass over straight away to our two wonderful moderators for today's session, Faisal and Leander. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Francisca, for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Dr. Leander Candelici, and I'm a senior lecturer at the Center for Migration Studies, University of Ghana. And I'm honored to moderate today's roundtable discussion together with my colleague, who is Dr. Faisal Garba, who is also a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. Now, global academia is in the midst of a renewed debate and issues of interventions against the persistent inequalities in Africa and Africanist higher education, following calls for decolonizing academia. Migration patterns and policies, as well as research on them, are often deeply informed by post-colonial relations, and migration research has been slow in exposing and addressing its post-coloniality. This roundtable therefore seeks to address the structural inequalities embedded in Africanist migration research through a set of dialogues between researchers, journal editors, and then librarians who confront these issues in different ways. What are the most important actors, structures, cultures, and other barriers denying African and Africa-based scholars access to visibility and possibility of in mainstream migration research? Secondly, what are the main grievances and aspirations of African academics in terms of their career goals and their place in international migration scholarship? What are examples of practices, strategies, and changes that have increased the visibility of Africanist migration scholarship. Through these key guiding questions, the Roundtable aims to diagnose the persistent inequalities in our field and offer inspiration for ways to work towards more equity and inclusivity. And the structure of the Roundtable is going to be as follows. It will consist of 3 brief dialogues with speakers representing Africa and Europe-based perspectives on the workings of Africanist migration scholarship. Each speaker will share some initial thoughts and then engage in dialogue with their counterpart. At this point, we are extremely lucky to have a very powerful and experienced group of panelists who are experts in their various disciplines to share their reflections in the form of a dialogue. The panelists include, first of all, Dr. Kudakashi Vanyoro, who is at the African Center for Migration and Society, University of Wits, South Africa. We also have Ruth Nyabutu, who is the academic manager of the Refugee-Led Research Hub at the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford. And we're meant to be joined by Professor Elena Fidian Kwashime. And unfortunately, she's not able to join us today. She's the editor of Migration and Society Journal. But we have present here Dr. Sergio Cassioto, who is the managing editor of the African Human Mobility Review Journal, and also a faculty member at the University of Western Cape, South Africa. We have Mr. Kwesi Sewe, who is an assistant librarian at the University of Ghana, BAM Library, that's in Ghana, and Mrs. Jessica Ajele Mensah, who is the head librarian at the Parliament of Ghana Library. We are also joined by Asa Lone Moberg, who is the head of library, Nordic Africa Institute, Uppsala, Sweden, and Professor Heaven Crowley, who is the director of the South-South Migration Development and Inequality Hub, among other portfolios, together with Dr. Ibrahima Dia, who is the director of the Africa Center for the Study and Research on Migration for the AU. The two, Professor Heaven and then Ibrahima, will bring the conversation together by offering reflections on whatever is going to be presented by our speakers. So at this point, I would like to go swiftly to the first dialogue, which will be moderated by my colleague Faisal. So I hand over to Faisal to kickstart the roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leander. Greetings, everyone. It's really nice to see very old friends and acquaintances, but also colleagues whose works one has encountered. So it's nice to put faces to the names and know that these are not just names on pieces of papers or articles that we read. I mean, the idea of visibility, right, is at the crux of the debate around inequality, in knowledge production, who is cited, whose research is valorized. So the first panel will dive straight into this because it has connections with a number of issues around the political economy of knowledge production, but also the question of credibility, okay, and how people have access to certain outlets of publications, but also the way in which researchers who are grappling with these questions, make sense of them, in particular, how to overcome them. Now, as Leander said, we really are grateful and lucky to have a powerhouse of a panel across the day. So I will straight ahead move and introduce the panelists for the first dialogue. We have Dr. Kudakashi Vanyoro. Kuda is actually technically my neighbor, right? But the distance is about 24 hours drive if you drive slowly. So he's based at the University of Witwatersrand. I have never met Kuda, but we've been on platforms together. So it's really nice to be on another platform with him. And this time around, we have to promise each other that the next time we meet it to be in person. And the next panelist is Ruth Nyabuto. Ruth is with the Refugee-Led Research Hub at the University of Oxford. So Kuda, I will begin with you. And the question is fairly straightforward. We want to find out what your experiences have been in making your research known to a wider Africanist migration research community. but also the main grievances and aspirations, in terms of your own career goals and the place and how you kind of locate yourself in international migration scholarship. So Kuda, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Faisal, and thanks for the opportunity. Thanks to all the organizers for the invitation. Look, this is a very tricky question in the sense that the question of visibility for me is quite sort of double-sided in the sense that the work that obviously we're trying to do has to do with a particular community which is marginalized. So it's about migrants, it's about refugees. Myself, having the experience of leaving Zimbabwe to come to South Africa, at the time that I started being interested in migration was more of a personal sort of inclination, but immersing myself in a context where there was a lot of things I could relate to in that regard. So I suppose the other side of it is then how to do that, to do migration work as someone who also has that particular experience in a neoliberal space, called the university. That creates a bit of tension in the sense of obviously doing work that has to have some kind of double meaning. It has to mean something to you as a person who has those kinds of experiences. But also in the space you're occupying, there's also issues to do with publishing, the pressures of academia and everything of that particular sort. So I suppose the challenge mainly is how to sort of navigate that, how to position yourself in academia in a neoliberal space that's quite problematic in so many ways, or while also advancing the interests of the people that you're writing about. Is that even a possibility? So there are points where it does feel quite challenging and frustrating in that regard, particularly when one is trying to position themselves within sort of the global academic context where that issue of visibility is rightly important. So I suppose for me, the question that arises from the question is whether it's possible to achieve visibility for yourself and still oriented towards your goals and still advance those interests that you purport to be working for, which is obviously about the communities. So do you, particularly when it comes to then working as a professional, we know academia, particularly in the African context, is you're probably one of the most educated, but you're not the most rewarded, even let's say in terms of income and those things or sort. So people have to end up doing policy work, all those kinds of things, which puts you in a world where now you are actually dealing with and working within the same space that you're equally trying to problematize, where categories are you're the same categories you're writing about are the same ones that you're expected by someone you're working with on a particular a project, let's say around safe, orderly, regular migration. So there's this resistance always to sort of get captured within these other institutions, particularly the humanitarian institutions, and how do you not find yourself in a situation where you're simply writing about, say, decolonial knowledge production in a hypocritical way, because you are also somewhat involved in that particular industry for your own particular sort of welfare, especially for Black African academics, the places we come from, they need advancement, our families, there's, South African context, people call that Black tax amongst Black people who've been oppressed and marginalized. So the colonial experience still, sort of dislocates you into that similar catch all where you must now decide, so you never really win, if I could just sum it up in that particular way.
Thank you very much, Kuda. I mean, the issue of contradiction is one that we always have to navigate, right? What does it mean to be a critical scholar but also how do you think and relate to the world of policy, given how problematic some of the guiding categories are. So I will move to Ruth and hear the solution that Ruth will just lay before us, and we stop the roundtable afterwards. Over to you, Ruth.
Still on the same question?
Yes.
Okay. So just to give a brief overview, I am not a PhD. So I already feel like I'm questioning the kind of knowledge I'm presenting here, but perhaps that's a good beginning point for us. So just to give a quick overview about myself and what I do. So I first got into the field of post-migration when I came for my graduate studies here. And I remember one discontent I had after completing my MSc in Refugee Studies from Oxford was I really wanted to engage with the people who had experienced that displacement, and I wanted to hear their voices in academia, which was quite silent, and there wasn't much to hear from them. So I thought if I went into my African studies, which I did as my second MSc, I'd be able to place displacement and also place lots of the things that I was quite keen, considering it come from a host country, the host majority refugees within East Africa, that I'd find that place. And unfortunately, also those bits of silence there, which led me to the work I do with Refugee-Led Research Hub. The whole idea of Refugee-Led Research Hub, which is an initiative of the Refugee Studies Center, is to create a space where those with a lived experience of displacement take leadership or are able to gain what it needs, what is required to take leadership in knowledge production when it comes to forced displacement, when it comes to humanitarian work and related fields. So talking about visibility, the first question which comes to my mind, and at this point, I'm attempting to speak for my colleagues, which feels wrong already. And how I worked through that was we had a really good discussion with some of my colleagues, of which majority of them have had lived experience of displacement. One in particular who was quite helpful for me, helpful in this discussion, has lived in Kenya his whole life as a refugee at one of the refugee camps. And one thing that we came together to conclusion as you were talking, and it's something I've been reflecting on, is within even the very space of academia, there's a questioning of what is considered to be viable knowledge. There's some sort of gatekeeping to what actual knowledge is and what actual work, which is considered credible, is. So that in its very self also reduces who is considered to be like someone worth being considered as, viable, as verifiable. And which I'm really curious to hear how we're going to talk about it, and also to learn from other colleagues who are presenting here today, who'll be talking about it. Something else that comes to my mind is talking about migration research in itself, and from the way I've been reflecting about it. In as much as you're coming in as Africanist migration researchers, we are in the very sense writing and thinking about other people. And in the process of writing and thinking about other people, the question of visibility is sort of relegated to someone else. And here's where like question of power also comes in, and that power can work in different ways. It can help to further bring to light those who perhaps have not been heard for the longest time, but also it can reproduce what has been happening. And here perhaps the colonial epistemic coloniality comes in, of relegating some other people to just respondents, to just informants, and nothing else when it comes to designing how knowledge is produced. I'll leave it at that.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Ruth. I mean, just a quick one about this PhD thing. You see, in Ghana, we have two not very complementary meanings for PhD. One is pull him down, to kind of signify envy. But the other is more serious, actually, and we have to all consider whether we want to continue with this thing. It's called permanent head damage. So don't aspire to it. Okay. I'll come back to you. I mean, if we develop this point that you make about the inner contradictions that we face towards the social relevance of what we do, right? And so the question is there a disconnect between what Africanist migration researchers study and what is important to migrants and refugees? You know, and this is a programmatic question, you know, to say, okay, if there is, how can we overcome that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's always some kind of relevance. It's just, you know, it's obviously shaped by all these other forces and these interests. So it's really mostly about finding the relevance within, I suppose, within all the structural problems. So how do you then, and I suppose the first thing I was thinking about is what do we mean by someone who's an Africanist? Because even being African myself, I still struggle with that. And what does it mean in terms of a way of living and carrying myself, and the kind of research I do and the kinds of questions I ask? Because the sad part is that unless you are asking the relevant questions, which basically means writ large, the legible, the things that put you, out there, the kinds of questions everyone else is asking, and center yourself, whether you like that deliberately or not. You know, if you're going to do an academic project, your supervisors will always sort of push you towards, why does this matter? That question, right? So the relevance is always there, but I suppose it's about who is this relevant for? In our training, it's largely relevant for that, for your visibility to the global audience, to the sort of to the Western canon. We always have to start from particular premises, even if you're doing your work using the most Africanist scholars, or even your Kwame Nkrumahs and the like. You always have to situate it and position it in relation to the West or to something else, right? So there's that pressure inherent within academia that shapes, I suppose, what relevance means to us, such that by the time we're now doing work and trying to shape it to be relevant, it's already shaped by those forces, that so much that the best we can do in that regard is still to do the research, but think, okay, how can it be somewhat beneficial? And that question of being beneficial almost always sounds like it's somewhere at the back of the head, because like I think I think it was you, Faisal, who mentioned that ultimately the one way that things get resolved is that research is Linda Twice Smith calls is a dirty word in itself. So doing the research is not really going to really be like 100% relevant. It will always have that, okay, there will be a 20% thing that you get out of this, but also it's constrained around the kinds of ethics we have. We can't really build you a house. The fund that just gave us money to come here and do the interviews, write the papers, and then we move on. So we're always constantly underselling. We're not trying to oversell the product. So this is not a space for those kinds of changes. So maybe that the question is relevant, but the real relevance lies somewhere else, or in a different kind of institution than the university that's modeled already within these. Because to even get to do more research and access more communities, you need to grow up the ladder. You need to become more academic. You call it the permanent head distraction. You need to be permanently more and more professorially distracted, in your head, to actually become influential enough to still continue to do the work and access more people, access more funding. So again, you're getting sort of deeper and deeper into the contradiction, and hoping to find some kind of relevance at the end of it. It's always going to be a kind of predetermined, somewhat little floating kind of relevance. Perhaps it's about accepting that it is there. Obviously, there's other ways. You could do participatory work. You could do all kinds of other work that gives space and opportunities for your participants to be more involved, to shape the research process. I mean, I'm aware of that. But I do think that it's really difficult in this space to really say that the work is going to be particularly altogether relevant, and unless it looks something else that we inverted, that we're yet to see, in something radical, I really don't think that we can really expect to see see much. And obviously who ends up calling that the work we do relevant is the funder, who then can shape, policies that sometimes are even securitized, so they get to count people, know what to do. So it is relevant for governance and, and influencing these policies we have now. But if anything, over the past 10 years, there's been so much research done on migration, but that's been accompanied by more and more xenophobia, securitization, hate, and all sorts of and the Rwanda deals, the EU, all those things that have been happening. So think of it in that way. I don't think you see much of a relevance for the people that we're doing the research for.
Thanks, Kuda. Ruth, I mean, the fact that your outfit is called refugee-led migration, research, for me signifies something, right? Tries to grapple, with the divide that is inbuilt in the mainstream approach. So my question really is to try and get some reflections from you around what your experience has been trying to bridge this gap and what it would take for all of us to make our work more useful, for the communities that we purport to be working with. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that question. And just to, before responding to that, to mention something, to pick on something that Kuda has brought up. Actually, when I was thinking through some of the questions that were presented to us, I felt some sort of hope looking at the kind of work that I'm currently doing. And if we continue to have more similar refugee-led research hubs, and I'm particularly speaking about the refugee here, and the way we define the refugee, at least for the organization, is we expanded, of course, the legal definition per UN convention, but also to take in anyone else who has a lived experience of forced displacement. So think of stateless, think of asylum seekers, think of, and the umbrella term is quite big. So what I meant by I see some sense of hope is, I think if this is to, will the results be seen like right now? Of course, no. Maybe slightly yes, because as Kuda has said, you need to go to a certain level of academia for you to produce knowledge that is considered viable, but also that's something worth questioning, because I don't think knowledge can be relegated to being produced by only a certain group of people, or a certain group of people who have a certain qualifications. Having said that, I see some sense of hope that, let's say, a couple of years from now, and if more people are to borrow the structures that we are coming up with, to have a space where those lived experiences of displacement are, and I'm using this word loosely, empowered, or have whatever it takes to actually be in that space. I think then the change can continue happening. And I'm not presenting this as us being the first people who are doing that. I think there's many other people who've done that, but definitely that can lead to that change. And to share my experiences from it, from my involvement and what I've seen, especially working closely with my colleagues who are embodying the very idea of taking leadership in knowledge production and research, is something which was shared by or written by Mbembe a long while ago, where he was unpacking the whole idea of epistemic coloniality and looking at how, as researchers, we produce lots about others, but never fully acknowledge these other people. Like, we know so much about others, but not acknowledging them. And in terms of reflection, what acknowledgement here means, and it's perhaps something that many of you have grappled with, is what meaningful engagement or participation looks like. So moving beyond, I see you with a certain gaze. I see you, refugee, as a victim. I see you, refugee, as someone who's to be shown sympathy and empathy. Well, that's definitely worth being used as a lens. It's walking above that and seeing agency, and seeing the refugee, or seeing this person as a knowledge partner, an equal, someone who you can work together with to develop new ways of thinking. So that's one thing which I have seen embodied in the work that we do. And I've seen most colleagues bring that up. See me as an equal, see me as more than that, you know. Something else that comes to my mind when reflecting on our experiences is, of course, the bureaucratic and institutional challenges. We are based within the university, and without me saying too much, I think it's challenging. Question of funding comes in. You just can't do research out of no funding. So looking for people who are keen to support that. And there's bits of hope there because many institutions, especially non-academic institutions, are key to see the knowledge which is being produced to inform their policies. So there's bits of hope there, but still, same challenges continue to exist. Also, there's the whole issue of agenda being set, and I think something could have touched on already, agenda being set already by these organizations that are funding. We want to see this. So we want to see you doing things differently, but also we want to control how differently you do things. So it's sort of like making no major change to that, and that can also be a challenge. Another challenge that can go into that, and again, in the same way as Kuda, I was questioning the whole idea of who's Africanist, who are we thinking of? And I settle for the idea of anyone who's really interested in researching about the continent and has done lots of work towards it. But I think we cannot downplay the biases that we come with. Even me, for example, as a Kenyan citizen writing on refugees, these biases which I come with, which are informed perhaps by the ongoing politics, and also inform the kind of language that we use. So one thing that the organization, and I'm going to stop after this, the organization or the work we've been doing has led us to think about is questioning language. Perhaps could there be a problem in us thinking, using that migration lens, the refugee lens? Of course it's there, but when approaching our work, how about thinking about mobility in general, looking at it as a vital aspect of human beings, that human beings will move? Why is it that when a certain body moves, it's problematized compared to when another different kind of body moves? So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ruth and Kuda. Please, virtual applause for our two panelists. I will now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Leander Kandelige, to move to the second dialogue. Thank you very much.
Right. So thank you very much, Faisal. Thank you very much, Kuda and Ruth, for setting the scene. So the next dialogue is around the issues of publication. So we look at inequalities in the case of access to international publications specifically. As I indicated at the beginning, unfortunately, because Elena is dealing with some family emergency, she's not able to join us today. But we still have Sergio, who is going to do justice to what will now be a dialogue between himself and me, rather than a dialogue with Elena. So just to get going, the issue of publication is really critical. What advice would you give to scholars from Africa on what they have to do or what they must do to get published in international top journals? And I ask this question bearing in mind the need or the pressure on African scholars to not only publish in local journals, in universities or within the continent, but also to target international. And most times, international is taken to mean outside Africa, unfortunately, instead of international being another country on the continent. So broadly speaking, what advice will you have for African scholars in that domain? Thank you.
Well, first of all, good afternoon to all of you, and thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be part of this very interesting discussion. And before I answer to your question, I think it's important that I just spend a few words about our journal, the African Mobility Review, and also what I would like to do is, kind of set the context of migration journals in Africa. I know your question is about international publications. But to answer to that question, there's a few things that I would like to say before, and I hope you will be indulgent, considering that the other panelist, unfortunately, is not here today. So I think, probably from my side, I would like, to bring the discussion from a more theoretical perspective to, the ground level, bringing, our first-hand experience. Unfortunately, our chief editor, Professor Mulugeta Dimbabo, couldn't make it today for some urgent family matters. He had to travel to Ethiopia. So, well, let me start first, just saying a couple of words about the journal and what is the purpose of this publication. The African Journal, African Human Mobility Review, is first of all an online open access journal. We publish 3 issues per year, and the journal is accredited in South Africa by the Department of Higher Education and Training, is indexed in Scopus, DOJ, AJOL, SILO, and other international indexes. The purpose of the journal is really to to encourage and facilitate the study of all aspects of human mobility, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the goals is also to build the capacity of young African researchers, give them exposure, give them visibility, so they can, publish and disseminate their work widely. Also, we try to identify best practices in suggesting guidelines for implementation of migration policies in Africa. The journal was established almost 10 years ago in 2014 and is jointly hosted by the University of the Western Cape in South Africa and the Scalabrini Institute for Human Mobility in Africa. Scalabrini is part of an international network of faith-based organizations that have centers across the globe, and they also publish academic journal. You might know International Migration Review, the Journal on Migration and Human Security. There's an Pacific Migration Journal. All these journals are published by the Scalabrini network worldwide. So having said that, why did we start the journal, and what is the situation, the context of migration journals in Africa? Well, basically, there's virtually none except our journal. And it's interesting, in 2021, the Peace Research Institute in Oslo identified 29 English language peer-reviewed journal on migration. And none of them was published in Africa. None of them is an African-based journal. And back then, our journal was not indexed in Scopus, so we did not appear in that particular research. Also, what we know, because we did a sort of mapping exercise, we want to see how the theme and the issue of migration is relevant within publication inside the continent. So we use the age-old database, and we kind of identified 14 journals, and then we restricted our research to 7 journals, mainly based in Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, and Senegal. And these are journals that they somehow deal with migration issues, although migration is not, the main focus. So the first conclusion is that most journals in Africa tend to exclude migration-related issues. And in terms of the content, there are some issues that are more prominent and others that are less prominent within the African journal. Now, moving back to your questions about the publishing in international journal, I think it's, from my side, it's difficult to answer this question unless I pose two additional questions. And the first question is why African researchers want to publish in international journals. And the second one is, how do we define top and low ranking journals? What are the criteria, and why many African journals are not indexed in the main indexes? So why African want to publish in international journal? You know, we all have our experience, but I think ultimately it has to do with, you know, some of the criteria for promotion. Scholars, they have to publish in what we call reputable journals, and often this means international non-African journals. Also, there is a desire to be recognized as a researcher at the global level, not just at the African level. So it is understandable that African researchers, they want to publish in accredited and top international journals. So their work can be, according to their view, not just confined to the African reality, but can also be acknowledged worldwide. But I think there is a perception within African scholars that international is better than, in terms of quality, than local. So what is interesting to me is that is often a deliberate choice for researchers not to publish their work within local journal, but rather trying to publish within international journal. So I would say, you know, as a sort of provocative statement, I think that Africans indirectly contribute to inequality. It might not be intentional, but the fact that they often prefer to publish in international rather than to local also reduce the local visibility of their work. So I think there is one of the paradoxes that there is not just low visibility of African research within international journal, but there is also low visibility of African research within African-based journal, which I think is interesting. And then the other question is about, you know, we talk about top international journal. What do we mean? What is a top international journal? What are the criteria and who establish those criteria? For example, is, you know, if a journal is not included in Scopus Web of Sciences, one of the main indexes, does that make it a low quality publication? And, you know, even more important, why, you know, many of the African journals do not appear in these international indexes? It is because of the, you know, the requirement, publication and technical standard, are this requirement too stringent? So I think, yeah, it's hard to respond, you know, to give advice and respond to your question unless we, I think, we critically reflect on why there is this, you know, push for people to publish in international journal, and also how do we define the quality of a journal, local journal versus international. You know, there's a whole discussion about predatory journals. It would be also interesting to get an understanding of how we define predatory journals. But just to conclude, I think what the previous speakers have said is absolutely relevant, but we need to also be aware that in a way or another, there is also, you know, some damage that is done by African institutions and African researchers to local research, which in fact reduce the visibility of their work.
Yeah, I think that's actually very relevant, and it reflects the realities on the continent. But if I may follow up with a final question for you, do you have any advice for your colleagues, like fellow editors of journals on the continent, on how to attract African scholars? There's a lot of work that is generated or produced by African scholars, but that work sometimes doesn't get to journals like your own and other journals on the continent. Any approaches or strategies or advice that you might have for your colleague editors? Thank you.
Well, I think, let me take it from a broader perspective. I think a suggestion to improve migration research visibility, from my point of view, my experience and our experience, and again, it might be completely different for a different field of studies. I don't know, in the scientific field, there might be completely other, criteria for other kind of subjects. But I think what is lacking is that there are basically no journals on the continent that are dealing with migration. So my suggestion is, it's not that difficult to start a journal, and we are actually we are an evidence of that. It doesn't take that long. It doesn't take that much resources. So my advice would be, I would like to encourage, African institutions to develop local journals and enhance publishing infrastructure locally. Of course, in order to do that, you need adequate funding. We know this can be an issue, but with the shift from digital, to digital publishing, I think it for certain reason it can present challenges, because people have to acquire certain skills and know-how. But on the other end, it also open up a lot of opportunities for those people who want to establish, for instance, an online and open access journal, and skills can be acquired. There are organizations on the continent that provide that kind of support. So my advice is really, if we want to increase the visibility, we need more journal, we need more publishing structures within the continent, because there are simply too few. I did mention certain countries where most of the African-based journals are located, but those are only 7 countries out of 54. So we also need to understand that within the continent, the situation is not the same. South Africa has one reality. Ghana, Ethiopia is another one. What about, for instance, French-speaking countries in Africa? It is more difficult for researchers to disseminate their work if they are non-English, speaking researchers. So we also need to distinguish that. But yeah, just to conclude, I think I would like to people need to realize that it's not difficult to start a journal, and you can bring it really from scratch to the top with dedication, with work within a short period of time, with of course some financial support and adequate resources, but it is possible. So I think that's the way forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. You agree with me that Sergio has made full use of the time that was allotted to this particular dialogue. So we are most grateful. And I know when it gets to Ibrahima's intervention, he also probably bring us to speed about the journal that has been launched by his center on behalf of the AU, and all that is going to contribute towards expanding the field and the access for African scholars. So at this stage, we want to appreciate Sergio with our usual virtual hand clap, and then move swiftly to the next, and that will be the third and final dialogue before we go into the reflections by Heaven and then Ibrahima. So I'll hand you back to Faisal to take us through the last dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leander and Sergio. I mean, the issue of publication is a very, very important one, but equally important is the question of access, right? I have a colleague who published a book with Routledge, and he got the usual author complimentary copies, and for some reason he lost them. And he was trying to get another copy, but he could not afford it. Okay, it was way above his pay grade. So the question of access and access in the various formats, in particular digital access, is an important question on the continent. So the third dialogue is around challenges and potentials of digital infrastructures in the academy. So we have three colleagues, Kwesi Sewe from the University of Ghana Library, and Jessica Ajele from the Parliament of Ghana Library, and Asa Lund Moberg from the famous Nordic Africa Institute. She is with the Nordic Africa Institute Library. So we're going to begin with Kwesi. So Kwesi, this thing of digitization, right? So how has digitization of the library resources contributed or stalled the visibility of African research? In a sense, you know, what has it meant for researchers in Africa, given that materials are increasingly being digitized? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Faisal. Digitization of library resources, I would say, has contributed and continue to play a crucial role in enhancing the visibility of African researchers in several ways. And I would explain some of these ways. I think first and foremost, digitization has enhanced global visibility. Digitization has made it possible for African researchers to share our works on a global scale. And I would give an example. I mean, we here in University of Ghana, we have a very rich historical records. Some of them predates the 13th century, and it used to be difficult for researchers to have access to them. And since we digitized them in 2010 and made them available on our repositories, now researchers, regardless of their geographic boundaries, are able to access them. So that's one area. Again, digitization also allows for the preservation of, indigenous knowledge and, cultural resources. And by this, African researchers can contribute to the digitization of traditional and heritage materials, ensuring that our cultural heritage is not only preserved, but also made accessible to a wider audience. I would say that many digitized resources are also made available through open access initiatives. And what it means is that research findings are freely accessible to anyone with internet connection. And this has the potential to increase the impact of African research by removing financial barriers to access. Talking about impact, digitized research is more easily discoverable. In turn, contributing to the recognition and impact of works conducted by African researchers. And I would also say that digitization of academic journals, that's a point Sergio has made, and publications are also provide a platform for African researchers to publish their works and make it available to a broader audience. It's also easier for us to share information, share our data and resources. And the effect of that is that African researchers can now participate in global discussion, share their findings, and contribute to, the collective knowledge in their respective field. I would, however, say that while digitization of library resources has brought some numerous benefits and positive changes, there are also some challenges and factors that have stalled the visibility of African researchers as a result of digitization. And I would explain a few of these factors.
Okay, so just quickly, because we're running.
So some of the areas that digitization has affected us include deepening the digital divide. I mean, not everyone has, the technology infrastructure to access these resources in digital format. I mean, there are also issues of, digitization is also capital intensive. There are also property, intellectual property concerns as to digitizing some of the local knowledge and all that. I think I'll end here. If there's time, I would explain maybe some of the ways that we can address some of these challenges in terms of how digitization has stalled the accessibility of African research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll move to Jessica Ajele-Mensah of the Parliament of Ghana Library. And Jessica, I want to pick your thoughts around this question of open access, right? So the potential, but also in a small parenthesis, the pitfalls of open access, for African researchers. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so open access, as we term it, is an initiative that encourages people to get documents. So we get the documents freely without any barrier. And for Parliament's Library, we have what we call the institutional repository. And this institutional repository is a way of getting all the documents that we have in Parliament, parliamentary papers, our Hansas, and all these documents are available on the institutional repository. This helps everybody to get access to the documents without any limitation. It also helps people to get it 24/7. In fact, everywhere you are, you can get access to the research papers without any barrier. Open access also help people to get journals. They have access to research freely on global audience. They also foster international collaboration, because this open access is the document is always available, and it helps the people to chance on these documents anywhere they get it. Hello?
We can hear you.
Yeah, okay. So open access has significant potential for African researchers by offering them increased availability, global collaboration opportunities, and enhanced accessibility to scholarly information. It has a structure, encourage the establishment and support of open access that's specifically focused on African research. This can also help showcase the diverse contributions from every continent, that is wherever you are, or whoever have printed anything outside. It's open access. Once it's open, everybody can have access to it. They can have make contributions to it, and without when they don't have any even access to internet or whatever it is. When internationally, it increases the visibility of people to get access to whatever document they are looking out for. Again, open access also have what we call it encourage collaboration. It fosters collaboration between researchers and institutions, other global counterparts. It also helps integrate African research into international exposure. It also helps publishers to also get access to whatever others have published worldwide, and for them to also chance on and help in their research or in academic aspects on whatever they do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. So I'll quickly move to Asa. And Asa, I mean, we've listened to the great opportunities that comes with digitization, open access in particular, but still the question of structural exclusion remains on the table, right? So how do we deal with the
Yes,
question?
thank you. It has been so interesting to listen to everyone. Well, structural exclusion, open access resources, and the kind of possibilities that you have when the things are digitized, and you have digitized library resources and digitized African research. I think here is really one task where a librarian can help with in different capacities, because what librarians can do to counter the structural exclusion is to look for those keys within the publications and within the library resources where we're able to move the content that are outside of the mainstream for academic publishing infrastructures and for library infrastructures, to move that content a bit more closer to the mainstream. And I'm talking about something that's quite easy here, you know, the bibliographical data. So this is where the librarians are professional. We can use our library infrastructures to place bibliographical data connected to Africa published open access resources, to place that data strategically so it can be harvested between different kinds of information systems, because the potential of electronic resources is that everything is machine readable. And that means it can be caught up in the kind of automatic flows, information flows that are between the various systems. So whenever a librarian can step in, or a publisher who works with the bibliographical metadata, wherever we can step in to improve discoverability and to enhance that data, it means that things turn more visible. So, but as is mentioned, the structural exclusion, what are the kind of structures that are there? You have the structures for academic publishing that are provided by the different kinds of journals and the different kinds of publisher. But then you also have the library infrastructure that is provided through the large library system provider and the content provider. And as librarians, we can be advocates to suggest content for the knowledge indexes that are provided for our different library systems. The ongoing decolonization debate, the library systems providers who set together these knowledge indexes, they are also aware of this debate, and they are actually looking for regional content for their knowledge indexes. So if we are librarians who are part of the kind of large library system, we can suggest content for the content provider, and that would be one step to move the content a bit outside the mainstream into the more mainstream. Another thing is, I appreciate that Kwesi talking about the institutional repository, and Jessica as well, because there are so many things that you can do as an individual researcher as well. And you all know about your personal ID and Google Scholar identity, etc., etc. But using, because visibility and dissemination is very much within infrastructures, it is very much about how many entry points are there to your research. Are there entry points through the electronic journals? Are there entry points through library catalogs? Are there entry points through your internet identity? Whenever you are able to add more entry points, your research turns more visible. So parallel publishing in institutional repository really contributes to the dissemination. I think I've used my time, and but these were some points that I've been thinking about.
Thank you very much, Asa. So please let's appreciate our three panelists with our usual applause. Thank you. So I hand over now to Leander to moderate the overarching reflections. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Faisal. This has been fascinating. You know, we've covered a lot of ground within a short period of time, looking at the issue of decolonizing migration research, also touching on the issue around journals and also access and issues that are restricting African scholars from being able to be visible within the academic space, and practically taking lessons from the three librarians who have everyday working experience in terms of guiding academics on the continent and people interested in African-related research. So at this point, we have two of our colleagues who are going to try and then provide some overarching reflections on all three dialogues that have taken place. So I'll start with Heaven, who is the director of MIDEC, the largest migration and development research, which incidentally has focused on this issue of giving access and giving that type of power to the global southern partners. It's a collaboration between the global north and the global south, but largely driven by the interests, the suggestions, the ideas of the global south. So you can appreciate the fact that Heaven's work is integral to this overarching debate around decolonizing migration research. So Heaven will go first, and then we'll hear from our brother Ibrahima, who is the director of the center I alluded to earlier on. So Heaven.
Thank you, Leander, and thank you everyone for the really interesting discussion. These are things that have been really at the forefront of our thinking, I guess, within MIDEC. And just to say a little bit more about MIDEC, for those that don't know the project, it is, as Leander says, really trying to very explicitly and consciously decenter the production of knowledge on migration, whilst recognizing that the power and the structural inequalities are so weighted against what we're trying to achieve that actually the process of understanding how those things happen and how they can be challenged is as important in some ways as what then happens in terms of that content. So I think we're learning a lot from MIDEC about the challenges of decentering. We kind of set out with this aspiration to not just talk about, not just theorize what decentering or decolonization might mean, but actually to somehow do it. And of course, in so doing, we've met many of the challenges that have been raised today. And just in the interest of time, because I think Ibrahima and I have about 4 minutes each for this first reflection, there's 4 things I think that have really been challenges for MIDEC, which have really been captured by some of the comments that others have made. The first of those is around the framing or the shaping of the issues that we choose to look at, how we come to look at them, the way in which global north concepts and theories have kind of driven that research agenda, very broadly defined, partly by privileging and prioritizing migration over other processes, including processes of capitalism, neocolonialism, and inequalities that actually fundamentally underpin why migration happens in many contexts and how that migration happens and what the often pernicious consequences of that migration is. There's been a tendency in the global north to concentrate or focus on migration as process rather than migration as something that's linked to these more fundamental structural inequalities. But we also find ourselves engaging with categories which, as I think Kuda and others have said, are categories of which we are critical, and yet they become the starting point for the framing of these issues. So we want to critique the concepts, but even in doing that, we end up privileging those concepts. So it's a real, tussle between, on the one hand, wanting to generate and create new knowledge and new perspectives, but at the same time having to critique and engage with that which already exists to be seemingly relevant. And that links to the second point. Actually, just one more on that. I think the other danger, if you like, is, and others have alluded to it, is flattening out or kind of making homogeneous this concept of North and South, right? Or even Africa as a continent, when we know there to be huge variation between the privileges and opportunities that exist in that context. and indeed the dangers of essentializing some sort of Africanist knowledge as if it's somehow running counter to a global North knowledge, and that these things are fundamentally, they have some intrinsic contextual relevance that makes them not applicable elsewhere. So I think all of those things around concepts are kind of connected in a way. But they link to this second thing, which is around funding. And others have, of course, mentioned it and talked about briefly about how important it is. But I think funding is important not only because most of the funding, not all, but most is kind of global North oriented in terms of where it's coming from, but because these concepts, these framings, then shape how the funders position and think about what's important in terms of what makes a good application, what gets funded, what doesn't get funded. And ultimately, and MIDEC has a very clear experience of this, it's a constant reminder of where the power lies. So at various points in this process, funders can exert authority or power over what it is that we do. And in the case of MIDEC, what that translated into was receiving a £6.2 million funding cut at 1 day's notice, and then having to somehow sort of reorientate ourselves to maintain the principles of the project, whilst simultaneously, you know, recognizing the huge damage that that does, not just to the ability to do the work, but to the relationships that you've built around it. So the power that sits with the funder is not just in terms of the concepts, it's tangibly, you know, whether or not people get paid. And that is a very stark reminder of that inequality in the ability to produce knowledge. The third point is around access to opportunities for, let's call it policy engagement, but I suppose what I mean here is how to make research relevant and make a difference. Many of us do research, not just for the sake of producing knowledge, as important as that is, but because we want to change the world with which we're engaging for the better often of the people with whom we're working. And that is, I now have a slightly different hat on. I work for the UN. And what's very interesting is who does and doesn't get a voice when it comes to representing or talking about the issues. And what I've noticed time and time again is that there is a desire to have the visibility of African and other global South researchers, but their voices are quite instrumentalized. They are used to promote particular arguments about participation, about representation, or about particular issues in certain geographical context. But other kinds of knowledges that might challenge the way in which the whole system is set up, or indeed the inequalities that drive it in the first place, there seems to be less space for those voices to be present. So it's like a very kind of controlled ways in which we let, we being in this case the UN system, but you know, the global North more generally, or the powers that be, allow certain knowledges to be spoken, but only when they are somehow aligned with the dominant political and policy interests. And finally, and I guess it's connected in some way to all of the points that I've made already, is this issue of language, which we've again heard about from a few of the different speakers. So there's a number of different parts to this. The first is language as in the conceptual language, and that can be difficult because how core terms are understood are differently understood in different languages, right? So even if you have this issue of translation and interpretation, it doesn't remove the fact that we have different interpretations of different words and understandings of those. The second is the predominance of English, which again, others have alluded to in terms of publications, etc. We tried very hard within MIDEC to, you know, move away from English as the predominant language, but only by moving to other colonial languages. So, I mean, even that is a very expensive process. The truth is that to translate things into 3 or 4 languages is very difficult, and it still is a barrier to all the other very many languages, including, you know, other languages and dialects that are much more meaningful to have these conversations about. So I think this issue of language, we need to understand it not just as a translation or, you know, interpretation problem, let's call it, although it often is. We need to understand what it does to knowledge production, and it does to the value that's attached to different kinds of knowledges. And to give you an example of that, within the lifetime of MIDEC, which is now coming up to 6 years almost, we have tried increasingly to find ways of enabling people to communicate in their own languages, or at least to understand through the different colonial languages what the conversation is that is taking place. And that has fundamentally shifted the power dynamics and relationships within the project, because we thought we were all kind of equal in the project. And then it became increasingly clear over the lifetime of the project that actually, even within our own relatively small group, 120, 150 people in MIDEC, even within that small group, there was not equal access to knowledge and to have a voice. And so I think kind of my point at the beginning, really, the processes of learning within MIDEC have been as important as some of the outputs. And maybe if we come back to the sort of what would we do differently, what could we do differently, then we could talk about some of those, but I'll stop for now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Heaven, for really touching on the core issues around language, the issues around funding, and so on and so forth. And you agree that this was a well-funded project to start with, and the cutting of up to £6 million overnight had the potential to derail the whole project. Now, when you reflect that on the global southern kind of scenario, where even the initial funding is a challenge to come by, not to talk of it being halved or chopped off whilst the project is ongoing. So issues of funding are critical, issues of language, and then even the fundamental issues that we've all talked about in terms of access. Yeah. So we'll hear from Ibrahima as well, who will also provide us with overarching reflections. As I introduced earlier on, he's the director of the Africa Center for the Study and Research on Migration. It's an AU center that was set up not too long ago. So Ibrahima, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, let me. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I'm very sorry because I have a cough and I have a kind of fever, but I'm going to try to respect the time and to be efficient. It was really excellent to hear all these perspectives, very fascinating perspectives. But I would start first by noticing that international visibility has not always been, the fundamental objective of African scholars. So it's really paradoxical, because if we consider, for instance, a prominent African scholar such as Cheikh Anta Diop, Cheikh Anta Diop has never been interested in being internationally visible. He was isolated in his laboratory, even facing political pressure, because at that time he was opposed to Senghor, ideologically and politically. But it's through his excellence in scholarship and production that he has gained international prominence and visibility. So we are witnessing a shift of paradigm as far as African scholars are concerned, where in the independence, African scholars were more interested in fighting against colonialism. They were more committed to contributing to the development of the newly independent African countries. And then research science were more connected to policy and to engagement. Right now, with the new generation, they are more focused on international visibility. So, but it's not visibility that brings international visibility also. This is also a second point. What I want to say that it's not because you invest in social media like Facebook, Instagram, to disseminate your knowledge that you are going to gain an international visibility. We have really to promote excellence. Excellence in scholarship, excellence also in reinventing the narratives of African migration by trying to understand migration from, I would not say an African standpoint, but trying to really reinvent theories and methodologies, as these theories are fundamentally biased and they are just reproducing the Western or the Asian narratives as far as migration studies are concerned. The third element is we talk about decolonizing academia, but unfortunately the decolonization process is mostly done by Western universities. It's very rare to see even, workshops or conferences in African universities talking about decolonizing African knowledge. I know that Codesria has done an excellent job as far as decolonizing knowledge is concerned, but it's still a marginal topic even in Africa. So most of the scholars that are really working on decolonizing knowledge are Western or Latin Americans. So we need also to really consider that we should not let other people doing the work we are supposed to do. Even so, they are really extremely, committed also to reinventing the paradigms, as these paradigms are our main challenges. When it comes to strengthening the visibility of African migration research, there are many challenges that we have to take into consideration. Funding issues, the linguistic barriers, not only between English and French, but for instance, Lusophone scholars are facing a lot of challenges, especially during conferences where the translation are only either on French and English and Arabic as well. So when we talk about African migration scholars, it's very important to take into consideration the complexity of African migration studies itself. When we talk about African migration, are we talking about Africans who do research on African migration, or Africans who do research that are not related to African migration? I just want to give my own example. I have been working on African migration issues, but Africa has not been my only geographical focus, because I also investigated the international migration of highly skilled Indians. And I was very surprised. Then one day I had a discussion with a scholar, and then the scholar was asking me, what makes you study Indian? Why you don't study Senegalese highly skilled international migration? I said, I consider myself first as a migration scholar before being an African migration scholar. Because unfortunately, there is a tendency to say, especially in the Western landscape, that this is our African specialist, meaning that he's the one who is in charge of all African issues, which can be biased. What I want to say is that while European or Northern American can study African migration, we're also capable intellectually, methodologically, and theoretically to study American migration, European migration, and Asian migration, and come up with a comparative approach that can contribute to strengthening not only African migration, but global migration in general. Because when we talk about migration, we need also to demigranticize migration, because it's about knowledge production in general. And when it comes to knowledge production in general, Africa is internationally marginalized. And people move where there is a circulation of ideas. The market of ideas is fundamentally linked with the market itself. In terms of trade, in terms of finance. So that's why we witness, increasing African migration, African international migration of highly skilled. And we can't talk about knowledge production, making African migration visible without talking about these issues related to brain drain and brain gain. Because if an African migration scholar, let's say, is based in the US, if he published extensively on African migration, but in statistical terms, he's not contributing to African migration scholarship. He's contributing to US scholarships as far as migration is concerned. Even so, he is working on African migration issues. So these issues also of brain drain, brain gain, and the underlying inequalities in terms of knowledge production, I think is fundamental. I don't want to talk about the issue of languages, which has been dealt, but we have also to consider the academic precariat. Most of the African migration scholars, especially in the global north, they are on a short-term basis contract, which can lead to, difficult living and working conditions. And as Africans, we are always on mission in the sense that we have to support our families and communities. And we are like ambassadors. So we have to remit financially. And academic research, is not really rewarding in the sense that if you don't have funding, you don't have the peace of mind to develop new theories, or to really deepen understanding of issues in an innovative way. That's why they end up, working as consultant. They end up on a policy-oriented research that is also marginalized in the academic knowledge. While policy-oriented research should play a fundamental role, because science without, if science is disconnected with the society, it has really, it will not have impact in terms of structural transformation of the society. We talk about migration research, but what about the politicization of migration research itself, in the sense that main paradigms and key issues are driven by stakeholders and international policymakers who are the one who provide funding. Last but not the least, also, when we talk about strengthening knowledge production, making international visibility of African scholar effective, we have to ask these key questions: who is going to do that, where, how, and why? And also we have to talk about also the issue of the academic migration market, in the sense that we don't have, like in Africa, people who are ready to fund African migration scholars, like local private sector or even philanthropic foundations, which in Europe and North America play a key role in providing funding to the scholars. And what about China as a best practice? For many years, the Chinese scholars in general were marginalized in the international arena, thanks to an aggressive policy and institutional support. Now China has come up with internationally recognized journals. And now Chinese people, they don't have, to stress themselves publishing in International Migration Review Journal or International Migration, journal. They can publish in China using their own languages. So it's very important that also we consider this option. And that's why the African Center for the Study and Research on Migration, one of its key mandates is to increase the visibility of African migration scholars at international level through this peer-reviewed journal. And if you want to have more information about the African Center for the Study and Research on Migration, there will be soon the website that will be available. But in the meantime, feel free to contact me, and you can be also added in the mailing list, because the work of the African Center for the Study and Research on Migration is extremely linked to this thematic area. I'm sorry if I have taken time, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ibrahima, for highlighting some of the critical and very practical challenges on the continent, and some of the biases and even some of the behaviors by African scholars that also tend to contribute to what we perceive as a problem around colonization of research and the fight or the demand for decolonizing migration research. So considering we only have 30 minutes left, we'll allocate 5 minutes and then just have interaction amongst the speakers before we open it up to our audience. So if any of the speakers has a burning question, or you have some clarification that you want from your co-presenters or your panelists, colleagues, please feel free to speak up. But that will just be for 5 minutes, and then we'll invite our audience to make a contribution. Whilst waiting for that to take place, please feel free to also put your questions in the chat function. I should have announced that at the beginning, but it's not too late. Just type your questions, and then we'll be glad to pass them on to the panelists to address. Alternatively, if you really desperately want to voice your question, there will be a limited opportunity for you to do that as well. But we plead with you to go straight to the point, so that other people have the opportunity to also ask questions. Thank you. So panelists, you have 5 minutes to put your views forward or to ask for further clarification. Thank you. Okay, so it doesn't look like at the moment they have any burning questions. So what we'll do is we'll go to the audience, and then you can jump in at any point if you have any questions or clarification that you want. So just to get us going, there was a rather lengthy question that was emailed to us prior to the start of the program. And I'll attempt to read it out whilst others try and then formulate their views on potential questions and then comments. The author says that many African scholars lack knowledge in migration because migration as a concept is not seen as a problem in the continent where people move without travel documents. Thus, families rather encourage their wards to study other professions rather than an irrelevant field. Few scholars who decide to delve into the field have chosen colonial approaches due to the risk of being shut down and sidelined and censored by colleagues. They are afraid to be critical in terms of critical migration studies options. And some have great ideas and concepts that lack the language to put them into perspective. He further says that there is also lack of well-grounded institutions of learning for early career migration researchers to nourish their aspirations for scholarship. Those who want to access such institutions in Europe and North America, where there are several of those institutions, they face great difficulties in terms of financial cost, placement opportunities, and administrative and bureaucratic bottlenecks emanating from colonial hierarchies. Unfortunately, according to the author, only few African scholars who get the opportunity, probably through scholarships and fellowships, to study in these institutions abroad will return to impact their knowledge, their acquired knowledge in Africa. Many of them stay behind, transforming the opportunity to study abroad into a channel of escaping bad governance and underdevelopment in Africa, which has a colonial connection though. All these create a gap in fostering knowledge production in the continent. And his question is, I am wondering how these issues could be adequately challenged or defeated. It's a rather long one, but do you have anyone who is brave enough to try and then address aspects or the whole of this question? Any of the panelists, feel free. Yes, Ibrahima.
Thank you very much, Landa. I think this is an excellent question because it also really connects to what I was saying, that we can't talk about a knowledge production and international visibility of African scholars without talking about the African migration, African highly skilled migration. You know, when we talk about highly skilled migration, we always tend to overlook issues of knowledge production, which is also a fundamental dimension. Like many African scholars, actually, they have been they got the opportunity, for instance, to teach at the universities in the US or Europe, because when they were based in Africa, you know, they produced excellent papers. Despite the challenges, they were able also to produce in high-ranking journals for some of them. So, which means that we need also to be very careful when we talk about, I mean, working and living conditions. There were African scholars who were really had decent salaries compared to their fellow counterparts, and there are African scholars who had also even excellent working conditions in the sense that they have their laboratories, they have a PhD or postdoc students, which help them, you know, to publish extensively, and then thanks to this excellence in publication, they were able to gain a position in the US. So my point is that all is not, I mean, challenging in Africa. Many African governments, they have really done developed significant efforts in providing favorable working conditions to the researchers, but it's also up to the universities also to create a conducive environment in terms of academic policy, in terms of institutions, Because if a researcher gets a scholarship to go to France or US for research, and if the researcher use that money to buy a house, it's really difficult. And these are really facts, actually. There are researchers who, despite the considerable challenges that African countries are facing, they got like a scholarship to go to the US, but they managed to use that money to build a house. And then I don't know how they manage with the travel agencies to get a fake ticket, you know, and this is a sad reality. So we have also our own responsibilities as researchers and scholars, because there are a lot of things that we can do without funding. For instance, at the Center of the African Center for the Study and Research on Migration, I have not waited until I got funding to start some activities. We have, for instance, launched the working papers, African Migration Working Paper Series, the African Policy Brief Series, and also other initiatives without any funding. So we have to be very innovative, and at the same time also, we have also to be, very patriotic and to love our continent. If you have decent living and working conditions, I think you have the minimum to do excellent research, notwithstanding the challenges. You don't need to have millions of euros in order to do quality work. But if you have been able to do research and publication, and then you leave the continent, it has several implications, not only in knowledge production, but also in the international, in the intergenerational transmission of knowledge and know-how. So it's very important that we try to understand the knowledge production from not only from an epistemological standpoint, but also from a political economy standpoint. What are the ideologies underlying knowledge production? Who is coining the concept? Who is funding the research? Why we are more focused on irregular migration, human trafficking, securitization of international migration, rather than migration and development, or student migration, or even internal migration, for instance, rural to urban migration. These are neglected topics. So the global market also influence the market of ideas. As long as African countries are lagged behind in terms of economic growth and sustainable development, they will be also always marginalized in terms of publications and knowledge production. And at the end of the day, most of their brilliant minds will just leave the country to contribute also to the already excellent research and facilities and knowledge production to global northern countries. This is my point of view.
Thank you very much, Ibrahima, for that intervention or the response. Any other panelists who wants to jump in? I've noticed that there is a question from Sonia that I'll read out in a minute. And we encourage other participants to type in their questions in the chat function, please. Okay, so Sonia says that very interesting event. I agree and understand the need for funding for research. However, aren't also there concerns about the potential impact of funding on the freedom of the researchers in terms of the subject matter and also reporting of funding? So she's asking whether we are mindful or not of the potential pitfalls. Having received funding, will that have implications, negative implications on the freedom of researchers to do the research that matters rather than the research that the funder is keen on seeing? Any reflections on that by any of the panelists?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. I feel like having had this funding experience, I can say something on that. I think it really depends on the funder, right? Because the motivations and in turn the requirements of the funder vary hugely. So obviously if you're funded by a government or you're funded by a particular agency who may have commissioned you to do the research for a particular purpose, then you're operating in a much more constrained way potentially in terms of the research. But for example, MIDEC or some of the other big projects, they're funded well, indirectly they're funded by governments, but they're funded through independent research councils. So whilst we experience a really, striking situation in terms of the funding cuts, we've had total freedom in terms of actually doing the research, in terms of the research questions, in terms of how we've decided to organize ourselves and our publications. We've had absolutely no limitations at all in terms of the content and the focus of the work, which would be very different, of course, if we were funded potentially directly by the British government. So I think it really depends on the type of funding. And I wonder whether I might, Leander, just pick up, there was a question that's kind of related that just came in as well, in terms of, when you have that possibility, what are the things that work? And I think Ruth might also have something to say on this in terms of that practice. And I think for us, the key thing has been that what has typically happened in Global North funded projects is that it's been a sort of form of neo-colonialism, because the kind of questions and the research design and the methodology has all been kind of constructed in the Global North, and then Global South partners have been engaged to be able to do the kind of data collection, and it's been a quite extractive process, which then the Global North researchers then analyze that data, write the publications, etc. That's a very typical model. And I think for us, the model is completely different. What we've done within MIDEC is basically redistribute the resources to the Global South partners and say, what do you want to do with the research? What questions do you want to ask? What's important for you? How do you want to go about doing it? And you do it in whatever way you think is most appropriate with the questions that you are interested in. Now, that also has its own issues in terms of comparability of data and in terms of, a lot of differences often in terms of approach, but in terms of generating knowledge that's relevant to context and that potentially has a difference, the potential to make a difference to what's happening. I think it's a really important approach. And I think in terms of, for want of a better word, empowering researchers to do what they think is important, it's the only way you can work with that dominant model of funding, which is predominantly coming from the North, and still enable some sort of decentering to be possible. So that's just the kind of my take on, it's about not just where the funding's coming from, but who precisely and how within the constraints of that can you set up research in a way that still enables new knowledges and new perspectives to emerge, essentially.
Yeah, thank you very much, Heaven, for that intervention. Ruth, your work in particular, you would have interfaced with global northern institutions prior to your time at Oxford University. I wonder whether you are able to give us some further insights into the second question, which has been dealt with by Heaven, by touching on the preconditions for reducing inequalities in the production of knowledge. Do you have any pointers from your personal experience that you are able to share? Thank you.
So I'll just share from some of the past experiences or what I've seen done within the organization. So for projects where our colleagues have had to work together with, we've had to work together with institutions based here in the West, what has happened is like working together as co-producers. So producing the knowledge together, designing the coming up with the research design together, working the budget from start to finish together, and designing proposals together. And there's also been a good uptake among allied colleagues. So professors within the university, for example, who are actively engaged with the refugee researchers from our hub, which has been a positive. Some challenges which have been there is, and some of the things that have been brought up again by colleagues in this working dynamics is the spaces almost tend to reproduce some hierarchical power, but I think it's a question of constantly working on this and learning in the process. Something else which has been helpful is, I think I've touched on a bit on inclusion, but also enabling pathways. So what enabling pathways look like, for example, within the hub is creating trainings and educational opportunities that enable those who are taking part in the research to have the capacity to actually do it, so that it's not just say like us just saying, oh, we need inclusion, but for those who are included, are they able to actually do it and be able to meet the researchers they're working with at an equal level? Just a few among a few things that I've seen happen well and still going on.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sure my colleague Faisal will take. There's a question from Jesper that's just coming to our library colleagues on open access. Are you able to take that, please? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Leander, and thanks for all the colleagues that have sent questions and those that have answered. So Jesper says, thank you for an excellent set of reflections, Kwesi, Jennifer, and Asa. I really appreciate that you all emphasize the potential of digitization and open access. Very inspiring. Could you say something more on the challenges for providing visibility and access? Are there resource issues, compatibility issues, or are there challenges in terms of making scholars and publishers aware of the possibilities? So anyone among Kwesi, Jennifer, or Asa can just run with it. Asa, do you want to? I see you are nodding. Do you want to?
Yeah, I can start. I can start. Thank you, Jesper. It's an interesting question. And it's really about, I talked about the kind of automatic flows of information that goes through all those kind of digital infrastructures, both for publishing and for the kind of library resources where you as a researcher or as a colleague take part of research from elsewhere. It's really about that you have a good format for the research or for the publication where your research is published, and also that the publisher is positive to providing the content to this kind of knowledge, huge knowledge systems. But it is, when we talk about the kind of research that is produced a bit outside of the mainstream, it's really about the publishers getting aware of how they can connect to these kind of automatic flows, or how they can connect to other larger part of the infrastructure. And it is difficult, but I would suggest publishers associations or to draw on the contacts that you already have. And of course, the Africa Journals Online was mentioned here earlier, and that is one really key actor when it concerns scholarly content from the continent, because they already are part of that infrastructure. So they encourage organizations, university presses that have journals to contact them and to include that content within the kind of infrastructures. So that's my take on it.
Thank you, Asa. Kwesi?
So in terms of increasing access to research, I think there are a number of ways that there are a number of strategies that can be adopted. I think the first one is increased research funding, which has been echoed several times. I think government and institutions and funders should also actively support and incentivize open access initiatives. It's very important. And then we should also invest in our digital infrastructure. I mean, issues of internet connectivity, access to technology, and I mean, to ensure that researchers across the continent are able to participate, I mean, in the digital academic landscape. I mean, we should also promote the issue of multilingual publishing. I think it's very critical. We should encourage the publishing of, if you like, journals in our local languages. And so that it reflects our, if you like, diverse linguistic backgrounds, and to recognize that these, languages all have equal, equal importance. We should also advocate. We should also create awareness and advocacy. We must advocate for policy change at the national and international level to promote open access. There are a lot of reasons, but I think these are a few ways that we can take to, address the issue of access. I don't know if that's what I can say now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kwesi. Jennifer, I don't know if you want to add something.
Okay, so I also think that they should provide them with fee waivers or discount for researchers from low-income countries, including those in Africa, to make them be able to publish their publications. And then they also need capacity building. They should be able to help them to, they train them to ensure that they can be able to bring everything, what they've published, into the limelight or digitize it. So that's all that I can add to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see Heaven has shared the MyDeck link in the chat box, but I also shared a link to the new charter on equitable research collaboration, that a host of institutions in Africa and beyond have endorsed. And I think it sets out some interesting criteria, basically, to not evaluate, but to attempt, to move towards a more equitable, a more grounded and a more fair basis for collaboration. So there's a question from Ngozi Louis Uzoma, says, I'm from the University of Nigeria. We are working in a Horizon Europe project in a consortium of partners around the world. I wonder why we were not asked to head a particular work package or deliverable at the initial stage in the proposal development. But during the research proper, our Nigerian team have been asked to do more and more things. It has been discovered that we have to be involved in writing the country dossier for Nigeria and even make some connections with what is happening in Niger Republic as a rentier state. Just a reflection. I guess Ngozi here is really putting out an experience that grounds the earlier points, that people like Heaven and others have made about this inbuilt inequality in terms of assumptions about capacity. You see, there's this thing, some people are what's in colonial anthropology are called native informants. So these people, they have this, if you like, organic knowledge about a particular place, but then you have those that can synthesize, right? These nimble, featured, clever scholars, who can synthesize things around the world. And I think what Heaven and Co have said, addresses that in some interesting ways. So the next point is by Gidrav Michuki. I hope I'm not butchering your name, forgive me. Thank you for organizing this thought-provoking and insightful virtual roundtable event. It appears that the global north is able to lead in research outputs, most probably because their governments and academic institutions are willing to invest in research. Not sure if there's a quick answer to my question, but I wonder if the panel have any suggestions on how to get African governments and institutions to increase funding to research in general. Hey, I wish we had the answer to this, we wouldn't have this panel at all, but we'll try. So we'll try. I see a number of faces here. I see Kuda, I see Ibrahima, I see even Leander, who is my co-moderator. So please, the other participants are also welcome to chime in. But Kuda, do you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah, probably my last word is just— I didn't get that. Reflection. Could you try again? Yeah, my reflection on this is, whether the answer lies is the answer in more research and more funding, towards doing more research, or whether investments need to be put in towards more, or resources need to be put towards more thinking about what the continent actually needs, what kind of agenda that could look like, as opposed to sort of simply moving forward and going about even this idea of open access and waivers. Where's that money going? It's going into the publishing industry that is so monetized, and we are sort of feeding the monster in a way. So is that what the continent actually needs, or it needs more investment in the kinds of local led kind of journals, the example that Sergio just gave us. So where is the where does that take us, I suppose, is the question. Even so the idea of doing more work, it means we are we just want to do the research ourselves, but we just need more money to do it. But are we doing the right kind of work? Is this the kind of research that if we had like 1,000 of Faisals or 1,000 of Leanders doing or Roots, then that's it, then it's equitable, then it's fine. I don't think that is the answer. So I think there needs to be that honest intellectual reflection about maybe it's just the start to getting there, but what is that African Academy that we're looking for? What is that supposed to look like? Who should be, going back to Ibrahim's question? Also if you're learning from the Chinese, is that context necessarily also reflective of what our experience is with the West? Because there is a reason why also there's always this relational thing between Africa and the West. So we need to also be critical about learning from those contexts, but also thinking through how that matches up with our own context and experiences. Are they facing similar oppressions, relationally speaking? Do they have similar challenges when they migrate to Europe? What does the kind of isolation that comes with simply writing in your own language mean, when you have governments that are still creating the same problems, that still force people to look to the West for solutions? China is completely different in that regard in terms of its own financial autonomy. So it really needs to be thought through, and I think that for me is we shouldn't be looking for quick answers. I think there really needs to be investment more in the processes Devin was mentioning, of coming up with solutions that are not going to it's not going to be done in 2 years. It will take a very long period and a lot of investment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kuda, for wrapping this up for us. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. It would have been excellent to hear from the other colleagues on this issue. But considering we set 2 hours for this conversation, I think we should draw the curtains at this point. But before we do that, is it possible to invite Francisca just to, again, restate how people can take more interest in the AMMODI network, if people want to sign up, the type of resources that currently exist, and the potential of AMMODI in helping us address some of the topical issues that have emerged during this roundtable. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Leander. I'm glad to also just give my big round of applause to all the wonderful speakers and to the excellent moderation. I think it's been such an interesting roundtable, and I'm sure everyone who's still here will agree with me. Just to make it very brief, AMMODI has a website, ammodi.com. I think most of you will have seen that when you were signing up for this roundtable. You can join as members. Some of you already are members. Otherwise, you can join up via the website and join our mailing list and find out about more events like these and others. And we also share any call for papers, any other requests or emails we get. So also, if you want to share an upcoming conference or new publication, just reach out to the AMMODI email address and we can forward it to the membership. And we have over 200 members in the network. And as I said at the beginning, we have this database for Africa-based researchers and scholars, and also articles written by Africa-based scholars on African migration, mobility, and displacement issues, which we would love for you to engage with, and also point us to anyone we have missed out so far. It's just, a starting point, as I said at the beginning. We're in the early stages, and we hope to further build on that database as a resource. And if you're interested in developing any other ideas, reach out to us at any time. So thank you so much to everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.